I voted for PROMESA because Puerto Rico's long span of fiscal irresponsibility needed to be stopped, and a promise of limiting litigation was inviting. Unfortunately, the law has failed to prevent a tidal wave of litigation, as was promised. PROMESA also set up an oversight board to facilitate voluntary debt resolution negotiations or movement of disputes to a court-supervised bankruptcy-like process. The promise of voluntary debt resolutions has not been fulfilled even for a restructuring agreement between creditors and Puerto Rico's power authority called PREPA, which had been agreed upon by both sides. The Oversight Board was also intended to oversee and monitor budgets for the various indebted arms of the government of Puerto Rico. On this front, I have also been disappointed, as it seems that the Oversight Board has largely been operating in the dark, often relying on the government of Puerto Rico for information of questionable validity. That said, I am not without hope. The Oversight Board has recently been slightly more aggressive in its demands for transparency from the government of Puerto Rico, and I hope they are successful in obtaining useful, verifiable information. However, the government of Puerto Rico has been and remains largely opaque. Mr. President, as just one example, I have asked government officials in Puerto Rico for audited financial statements for nearly 3 years now. Let me repeat that. I have been waiting nearly 3 years for audited financial statements from Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, the government of Puerto Rico has not provided audited financial information since fiscal year 2014. This is obviously problematic when trying to figure out how to best help Puerto Rico. And this is not a one-off issue. Recently, following numerous claims by government officials in Puerto Rico of severe, even crisis-level liquidity shortages, Puerto Rico finally got around to looking into hundreds of scattered government bank accounts and revealed late last year that it found nearly $7 billion of stranded cash. This is just one of many examples of how disorganized and inconsistent accounting continues to prevail in Puerto Rico, damaging the credibility of the government. But it doesn't end there. There have recently been attempts by the government in Puerto Rico to potentially politicize the Puerto Rico Institute of Statistics. Obviously, this is concerning. In a report by the Congressional Task Force on Economic Growth in Puerto Rico, members of Congress from both chambers and both sides of the aisle expressed that the Institute of Statistics, quote, has emerged as a highly professional, autonomous, and apolitical organization that is bringing greater transparency to economic, financial, and fiscal conditions on the island, unquote. Indeed, a recommendation of the task force was for the Institute to continue to protect its independence. Unfortunately, the Institute has been forced to litigate its independence, given an ill-conceived effort by the government of Puerto Rico to overhaul and potentially politicize the Institute. Mr. President, I know that there is bipartisan support for our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico. Indeed, I heard a lot of support by members here on the floor following the devastating hurricanes that hit the island. Some members seemed genuinely concerned, while others seemed more interested in trying to cast doubts on or politicize the disaster response from the federal government led by the administration. Nonetheless, I remain committed to working with anyone from either side to help and support the people of Puerto Rico. However, that work must involve compromise and mutual understanding of each other's concerns, and that has not always been the case, in my view. I've tried to work to provide tax relief to people in Puerto Rico, yet I continue to hear from some, including former Obama administration officials, that I must include access for Puerto Rico to the Earned Income Tax Credit. Mr. President, I have been clear about my concerns that administration of such a provision carries with it many possible problems, as highlighted by a report by the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation. Moreover, Puerto Rico already had its own earned income tax credit, which it subsequently did away with. It seems to want to resurrect the idea now and have every right and ability to institute such a credit on the island. However, I cannot support the, quote, advice, unquote, from some that I must support a provision involving cutting a big check from the Federal General Fund to the government of Puerto Rico for them to administer such a credit. I also cannot support the views of some in Puerto Rico, including government officials, that they were somehow left out of our tax reform efforts because they did not receive a special carve-out unavailable to anyone else. Subsidiaries of the U.S. headquartered firms that are organized as controlled foreign corporations in Puerto Rico for federal tax purposes were treated the same as similarly situated taxpayers anywhere else. In addition, if being somehow left out of tax reform means that provisions to provide some sort of tax haven status, as some in Puerto Rico asked for, then I think that the proponents of such a view do not understand recent history. In my more than 40 years in the Senate, I have always been a proud advocate of accountability and oversight. That is why I support greater transparency in the Puerto Rican government as well as the Oversight Board. I also support ongoing federal efforts, including those at the Treasury Department, to carefully and closely monitor federal funds provided to Puerto Rico for disaster and other relief. As always, we owe a duty to taxpayers to prudently safeguard their hard-earned dollars from being channeled into inefficient or wasteful uses. These and other reasons are why, in conjunction with Senator Rubio and anyone else here who wishes to join us, I am advocating for the provisions contained in the Puerto Rico Economic Empowerment Act of 2018 that I introduced today. Mr. President, let me end by reiterating that I want to work on a bipartisan basis and in the spirit of compromise with anyone here in this chamber to help our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico. Truly, theirs is an uphill battle.